Okay. And without further ado, I guess I was going to introduce myself a little bit before Cindy, and I'm new to the advancement team. My name is Samantha Hall. I graduated from Wells in 2018, and I took a gap year after I graduated from my studies at Wells, and returning to the work field, I started in admissions and got to recruit during the pandemic, which was a very unique roadmap, and we made it happen. I'm really passionate about my time at Wells. I was involved in student government and a lot of the traditions. So I'm really happy to join the advancement team and meet our
Sam was collegiate. She was collegiate president. Just so you know, she's too modest to say
Thanks,
that.
Larry.
She was a rock star on campus, just so you all know.
Thanks, Larry. And I feel really lucky to have a leadership position as a young professional with the Wellsian network, and learning just briefly about Cindy Avery and what she's done, plus the connection to Wells is what I'm all about. I lived in Aurora in Wave Bank next to Alan Cluxton for a little bit. So I'm really touched by this story, and I think we're going to have a great time. So I learned that Cindy worked in development, and right there in Pettibone, that switch from McMillan to Pettibone, I remember as a prospective student that the tour started in McMillan, but now recently Pettibone has taken over. And Cindy is the mother of 2 alumni that hopefully we'll get to all group together in Aurora someday soon. And I'm just so happy to see all the family connections as we were getting started. And Cindy's going to do a really great show. We did a really good preview earlier. And like I said, we had our tissues ready. So I think Cindy's going to tell more of the connections to Aurora, and I'll just turn it over. So thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you in Aurora soon.
Thank you, Samantha. For those of you that have been in Zoom before, if you wiggle your mouse or look down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat button. If you have a question during the presentation, you can hit chat, and then that will save the question that we can address at the end, if that makes sense. And if it doesn't, we'll modify and do something else. So welcome, everyone. I'm going to start, no, I'm not going to start sharing my screen yet. So Dad's experiences up to and a few years after World War II are what shaped him and guided him to be the man that you might have known. And if you've read the book, you know that everything that influenced Dad was found in Aurora, including my mother, who happened to come to teach at Wells while he was a P.O.W. during the war. My other connections to Wells go all the way back to some of the land that it occupies, the very first president, and generations of aunts and cousins from the very first class in 1868 to 2016, which includes 2 of my daughters. Heather, class of 1998, has been the keeper of many of Dad's artifacts, and you'll see some of those throughout the presentation. And Abby, class of 2001, designed the cover. So I'm happy to present that I have 1 even and 1 odd. The list continues. Stephanie Sutton Beavers, class of 79, worked with me for 5 long months to edit the book and then help me through the publishing process. A couple of you in this meeting called me Mom while you were a student, and many of you remember me as a face that greeted you when you came back for reunion. Some of you are longtime friends, former co-workers and neighbors, or one of my many Avery cousins. But whatever caused you to click the link, I'm thrilled to have been recommended by my lifelong friend and the Wells College Board of Trustees Chair, Muffy Chapman Carroll, class of 75. I'm thrilled to be giving this presentation of virtual learning by the lake. Tonight, I hope to present something that's educational enough to fit into the parameters of a Learning by the Lake course, but seasoned with a personal narrative. So I have to do a little disclaimer here. I am by no means an expert on World War II. My information comes from 2 years of piecing together Dad's paper trail and researching the missing parts to gain a cohesive narrative that reflects Dad's experiences. I'm learning more things every day, and there are quite a few slides of new pictures that do not appear in the book. So now I'm going to start sharing my screen. Bear with me 1 minute while we click through all this stuff. And it's not working. Hang on. There we go. Well, it's not working. Hang on.
The first one's blank, right?
Yes, but it's not allowing me to advance through it, so I'm
Oh.
just going to start again. There we go.
Perfect.
As the title suggests, My Father's Journey, American Pilot to German POW and Back, is a book about my father and primarily his journey through World War II. But his story is just one of over 16 million Americans who served at that time and one of 130,000 American POWs. Let me give you a little background in case you don't already know. Dad was born just outside of Aurora in 1915, but grew up in the village's idyllic setting, exploring the gullies and woods, playing in the lake, and what you might envision for an all-American small town boy during the Depression. And if you know Dad at all, his given name was Baldwin, but everyone called him Baldy. So my first picture is to show that he really did have hair when he was a little boy. And here he is enjoying Paynes Creek, exploring, and I hope you'll all notice the Wells Tower in the background. My sisters, Judy and Chris and I all grew up knowing Dad had been a rower at Cornell and that he was a B-24 pilot, two things of which he was very proud. We also knew that his youngest brother, Ben, a West Point graduate, had been killed at the age of 22 in a horrific plane crash while trying to return to Maxwell Field in Alabama. This had a huge impact on the direction of Dad's war experience. By the time he earned his wings, this is his graduation photo, he had been stationed and trained at 10 different bases over an 18-month period. It would be an additional 4 bases and 3 different types of aircrafts and another 6 months before he was assigned a plane and a crew and sent to England. And here's a picture of the original Chumley crew, Chumley being the name of his plane. And I labeled them all for you so that you can see the range in ages, 2 19-year-olds, 20, 21, 22, and Dad was the oldest one at 27. Not all of these men were on the plane with him when it was shot down. Chef was promoted to a squadron navigator and moved to another crew. And in February of '44, Bill Bauer filled in on the Dusty Demons crew, and only Bill and 2 others survived a plane crash and were captured. Chuck was replaced before they left the States. And here's his American dog tag. It has his ID number, it has his blood type over here in the corner, O, and P for Protestant, and his next of kin. I always love the fact that there's nothing here because of course there's no, 123 Main Street or anything. It was just Aurora, New York. I was 11 when the movie The Great Escape came out in 1963. And if you've seen it, you know that it's somewhat accurate Hollywood depiction of the British airmen at Stellalug Lift 3 who tried to tunnel their way to freedom in late March of 1944. The movie certainly glorified the life of Stellalug Lift 3 POWs, and until I was older and learned harder truths about his treatment, and more specifically the main topic for tonight, the forced march in the winter of 1945. Dad was shot down May 12, 1944 in a bombing raid. It was his 20th mission. He parachuted out of a plane that was burning and on a literal crash course with Mother Earth, and was captured after about 5 hours of running and hiding in a German forest. He had a torn thigh muscle, a broken rib, and a bruised lung. For 8 days, he alternated between being interrogated and being left alone in the cooler before traveling another 4 days to Stellalug Lift 3. When he got there, he was issued this card. AL can speak German, I can't, but I think this is Kriegsgefangener, which became Kriegi. It's military slang for an Allied prisoner of war in a World War II German internment camp. This particular paper would have been kept on file in the Commandant's office, and this card would have been portable and brought out for appel, which was what they called roll call. And if they were counting the POWs and somebody was missing, they would actually take these cards and match them to everyone's face until they found out who was missing. This is his German dog tag, and you'll notice the word Auflag Luft 3 right here. So I discovered that Auflag was the prisoner of war camp for officers, which my father was. And Stalag was the word used for enlisted personnel, and there were also separate camps for Navy and air crews were kept in Stellalug Luft, Luft being air, like Luftwaffe, and they also had them for civilians. But at some point in the war, all the camps seemed to have morphed to the use of Stalag, and I don't know if that was because it was no longer feasible to separate the officers and the enlisted men as the numbers grew and the camps filled, or it just became the accepted generic term for a POW camp. Stellalug Lift 3 is shown here. This was the how it was laid out, and it started just with the East Camp, which opened in March of 42 and for British RAF and Fleet Air Arm officers. Then the center compound was opened in April of 42. Then the North compound opened. This is where the Great Escape took place. And if you can see Tom, Dick, and Harry. And I always thought it was kind of odd that Tom was like going nowhere, but this section, this West Camp, wasn't built at the time of the escape. Harry was a successful one, so to speak. 76 prisoners escaped, 3 permanently. And again, if you've seen the movie, you know that it came up a little bit short of the woods. The South Camp opened in September of 43, and then the North and South prisoners built the West Camp, which opened in April of 44. So this, and Dad got there in May, so it was brand new. Except for the East compound, you can see that all of the compounds consisted of 15 single-story huts, and each bunk room was only 10 by 12 and slept 15 men in triple-decker bunks. Now, again, if you know my father, he was 6'4", so he slept on the top, and I'm thinking it was so that his feet could hang out, because I'm not sure how long those bunks really were. Here's again a picture just of the west compound showing Dad's block, they called it, number 158. And here's a schematic of what the rooms were like. Here's Dad's room, number 11. So this is where the big rooms all had 15 men in it. The smaller rooms on each end were single occupied by an officer. The latrine was only available at nighttime, and the washroom, according to the historian at the Stellalug Lift 3 Museum, was an empty room, cement floor with a drain in it that was supposed to be able to use as washing and shower and washing your clothes and whatever, but it was later converted to house men. They decided they needed room for them more than they needed to be able to shower. So let's begin. January of 1945. I didn't mean to do that. January of 1945 began and remains today one of the coldest European winters of the 20th century. Blizzards swept into Stellalug Lift 3 and plummeted temperatures to as low as 13 degrees below zero. Icy winds sifted through the cracks in the floors and the walls of the block. In mid-January, the entire camp received a directive from their Allied commanding officers to walk an additional 7.5 miles, which was 10 extra laps, each day around the perimeter of their compound, not the perimeter of the entire, because they couldn't, they were all separated, to prepare for a possible evacuation march. The track in the west compound became crowded and fraught with more rumors and speculation, and every step of the way, Dad complained to anyone within earshot that his only footwear was slippery English shoes with leather bottoms that caused him to slip backwards in the snow. Some of us have experience with walking in the snow in leather shoes, and it isn't easy. When he wasn't walking, Dad cleverly designed a backpack out of a GI khaki shirt. He said, "The rooms in our block look like a gathering of the ladies' sewing circle." He reinforced the buttonholes, stitched the front and back shirt tails together, and sewed up the front of the shirt as far as the top button. And then he tied a piece of scavenged rope to each sleeve so he could slip the shirt, now a backpack, over his head and shoulders and tie it around his waist. As somewhat the elder statesman, he's now 29, compared to some who were literally boys, Dad helped his younger roommates and blockmates through the careful selection of what was feasible and sensible, and discarded the frivolous and sentimental. With no definitive word about an evacuation and news that the Russians, who were our allies at the time, were gaining ground in the east and the south, Dad believed liberation was in sight and hoped that more purging would not have to be done. However, on Saturday, January 27th, 1945, at 10:30 at night, the men of Stellalug Lift 3 received their order. Dad said, "With the snowflakes coming down harder, the Germans told us to be ready to march in 1 hour. Then confusion reigned. We were 15 bewildered men, uncertain of what to expect, but ready to accept anything after what we've been through." They layered clean socks and as much clothing as they could while still being able to move, and packed extras of everything in their imaginative backpacks. They did not have time to divide up the larder, but they did manage to build enough of a fire to cook what they could and toast some bread. They helped each other struggle into overcoats and packs and tied blankets over their shoulders. And when the time came to form on the road in their appointed spot, a friend appeared from out of the heavy snow and gave Dad a pair of American shoes with composition soles. Dad was forever grateful to him. German guards and sentry dogs, straining and barking, straining at their leashes, lined both sides of the road and attempted to control the chaos involved in organizing 10,000 befuddled and resistant Kriegis, while other guards poured fuel on as many buildings as possible in an effort to burn the camp to the ground and leave no possible means of shelter for the audibly advancing Russian army. Just before they started out, word passed from man to man that the Germans intended to shoot 2 POWs for everyone that attempted to escape. Since they had cold-bloodedly murdered 50 of the 76 escapees just 10 months earlier, this seemed less like a latrine rumor, which is what they called rumors. They mostly passed them while they were in the latrine, and they say, hey, did you hear? But they decided this was not a rumor and more like a fact, and I'm sure no one was going to test it. And this is how 800 German guards controlled 10,000 men. At around midnight, the south compound men were the first to leave. Dad's west compound left next, followed by north, east, and center. It took 6 hours for the camp to empty out, and thus began the forced march for Stellalug Lift 3. As the men passed out of the gate of Stellalug Lift 3 for the first time in months, or for some, it was the first time in years, they trudged past the building from which their Red Cross parcels were normally distributed, a parcel that the commandant had been hoarding, and it was tossed to each marching man. This box happens to be a regular size Red Cross parcel that weighs 11 pounds. It's probably bigger than the one they actually received because by this point in the war, the men were on half rations. So I'm assuming that the package was half this size and only weighed 6 pounds, but still. The Kriegi ingenuity had led to the creation of every conceivable type of sled. Many, including the men in room 11, turned over the benches in their rooms to fashion sleds to carry the spare clothing and the extra food supply, and the men took turns pulling. This is a drawing by a man who lived in the block next door to Dad, and he has a very famous, well, you can find it on the internet. Bob Neary is his name, and he made a book of all his drawings, and it turned out that he actually ended up living not far from Dad in Florida, and they met up and Dad got a copy of the book. But this shows the men trudging through the snow. You can see the benches that they're pulling, the sleds. You can see here and here, the backpacks and the swirling wind. But with no time to stop and store the parcel in their packs or on their sleds, the men trudged along carrying the heavy box awkwardly until they had a rest stop several hours later. This is an actual picture of the march. You can see that the men are heavily laden with backpacks and whatever else they could carry. This does not appear in the book. I recently discovered it. So if you've read the book, here's something new for you. The procession of men, 2 and 3 abreast, stretched 8 miles. Let me put that into perspective. So if you're familiar with the geography around Aurora, that's almost the exact distance from Aurora to King Ferry. So picture that distance with 10,000 men. For some of you, you could picture 11,000 POWs and their guards on the streets of Manhattan, wrapping the entire perimeter of Central Park 1.5 times. It's amazing. After a few hours, the pace of the exodus slowed, and Dad and his roommates gave up on their so-called sled. The front dug into the 6 inches of snow and didn't slide, and Dad claimed he was the horse. Like many others in the miles-long column, they discarded their useless sled along the side of the road, and with it the clothes and food that the men were simply unable to transport in spite of desperately needing them. The storm developed into a blinding fury. A fierce wind caused temperatures to plunge to the -20s. During short stops, the weary men sprawled in the snow to rest. and continued this way for 28 miles. After 11 hours of marching, oh, here's another picture of the march. It gives you an idea of how it wound around and around. You can see the men way off in the distance. After 11 hours of marching, they finally stopped for 7 hours of rest and shelter in a small abandoned concentration camp. At that first stop, Dad had to make other tough decisions. Undernourished, underweight, and close to utter exhaustion, he did not know how much farther they would march or how long the inadequate food supplies that tucked in his backpack would last. So he lightened his pack by tossing anything he couldn't eat. In a move he regretted the rest of his life, he added hundreds of letters he'd saved from family, friends, and half of Aurora, to the roadside debris. Between the spare clothes, the extra food, the letters, the books, and the mementos from thousands of POWs, I imagine the countryside looked like one long continuous yard sale. There were some items Dad kept. When he first arrived at Stellalug Lift 3, he made dishes and a mug for his meals. He was given eating utensils by the Germans, and they were checked regularly by the guards to make sure that the POW still had all 3 pieces and they didn't show any signs of wear and tear from digging a tunnel. And this is his complete set of dinnerware. The plate, which I doubt you can see, but he hammered something in here, or his initials, BCA. And these were made out of Spam cans, whatever kind of cans the Red Cross may have sent. The utensils had the German insignias on them, and Dad said that every bite of food he took, he was reminded that he was a guest of the Third Reich. And the bottom of the can, you can just read Veg-all. And so this was a vegetable can that he made a cup out of, and he kept those with him. He also saved what he called his captivity calendar, which he made on the back of a wrapper from a chocolate bar that came from the Red Cross. And you can see the very first day that's shaded in is March 12th. And the last day shaded in is April 28th, as his liberation was on, his first day of freedom was April 29th. The weather and the tension and the mental and physical exhaustion took a toll. Even the German guards discarded some of their heavy ammunition packs to lighten their loads. At this point, the marchers stopped to rest every 45 minutes. Dad said, "When I rested, I did so on my knees with my head on the icy road because it was easier to get up from that position." The massive chain of men was now split into guard manageable groups of 200 or 300 each. The men in Dad's group of marchers were lucky. The Germans had commandeered some farm horses and a wagon, and for a time as the wagon went along, a weary airman claimed a spot and another jumped off to make room. At one point, Gersh, who was Dad's navigator, gave up walking and took a turn riding in the wagon. Dad carried his pack. Not long after that, Deacon, who was the co-pilot, was going to leave his pack behind, so Dad slung it on his chest. And he soon added Oral, I believe he was the bombardier, pack, dragged it behind him in the snow. So he is now carrying or pulling all 4 packs of the Chumley crew roommates, adding about 50 pounds to his load. And he humbly said, "I really don't know how long I did this, but it gave the guys some rest." As the long line of Kriegies lumbered along, groups became more separated as men dropped back, rode in the wagon, or just stayed in the snow, where flesh froze to bone and they died. Morale was at its lowest. The men were hungry, tired, and sick. But Dad was determined to do everything he could to keep his crew and Block 158 together. Before leaving Stellalug Lift 3, Dad had filled his pockets with lumps of sugar and dried prunes from their pantry stockpile. And from time to time, he provided his roommates with a bit of nourishment. He said, I would walk in front of my 3 crew members and pop a prune or some sugar into their mouths to keep their strength up. It accomplished the purpose. I only knew my father as a strong and fit man. However, at the time of the march, after 8 months of captivity, he was weakened by the loss of muscle mass and only carried about 170 pounds on his 6'4" frame. He fought blisters, exhaustion, and cold, but still did whatever he could to get to the other end of his ordeal alive and with his crew as intact as possible. He took his leadership duties as their pilot very seriously. This photo also is not in the book, but it just shows them collapsing in the snow, exhausted. The storm raged as the march moved on through the dark night. All around my father, the men collapsed in the snow, unable to take a single step more. Each time he passed a bundled figure by the road, Dad wondered who it was and if it was someone he knew. He tried to keep such torturous thoughts at bay. And when the snow finally stopped, the temperatures got even colder, and eventually there was no wagon, and those who could not walk or be helped by a buddy simply sat down to die, certain that freezing to death was better than walking, and given their conditions, their misery would be over in minutes. At around 6 or 7 the next morning, after another 18 miles of night travel, the refugees arrived at Muskau. The men had not eaten in 14 hours, and so despite their fatigue, Room 11 put together their supplies and made a paltry meal. After eating, the tired Kriegis spread their blankets out on the concrete floor and slept as though we were dead, Dad said. Before they were completely settled, many of the men had to decide if they should remove their boots. Not taking them off could lead to trench foot from the prolonged exposure to the cold and damp conditions. Taking off their boots could mean not fitting their swollen feet back into them in the morning, provided they, the boots, were not also frozen, or worse, spirited away in the night by a more desperate man. When they woke up, if they did, the Kriegis were stiff and sore from head to toe. Every atrophied muscle of these once fit, vibrant men was screaming and wanted to refuse to propel the body even one more inch. They suffered from dysentery, body lice carrying typhus, a starvation diet, and lack of fluids. The Germans now realized the difficulties in moving and controlling such a large number of men and decided to split the Kriegis into 2 groups. Dad, all of Room 11, and most of Block 158 volunteered to join the men from 2 other compounds. And this group of 4,500 POWs continued marching, slept in barns along the way, and nibbled at their meager food supplies. And then the weather turned warmer, which presented new obstacles. Melting snow turned the road into a sloppy mess as potholes from thousands of marching men filled with slush that seeped into shoes. The slight rise in temperature was enough to cause the men to sweat, which brought on chills and fevers when they rested beside the road or stopped for the night. On February 1st, 1945, the group arrived in Spremberg. Dad's group went to a gymnasium in a German garrison where they were given a hot cup of barley soup. This was the first effort from the German Guard to provide any food during the entire march. And it would be the last time the Germans provided anything hot for the next 3 months. He slept again that night on the floor. They had marched 6 days and 62 miles since leaving Stellalug Lift 3, most of it in a raging blizzard. So this is a map that shows Stellalug Lift 3 circled in red. That's where he started. When he got to Spremberg, they split off into groups. The rest of the POWs that weren't in Dad's group went to Nuremberg, shown here in the blue circle. But in Spremberg, Dad boarded a train. So he rode from Spremberg, which is that small red circle, to Moosburg, which was his final destination. So the next morning, his group boarded a train. 50 or 60 POWs were locked in boxcars where it was obvious that the previous occupants had been horses or cattle. Dad said traveling in the cars was far worse than marching in the snow. We tried to figure out ways to lie down, but it was impossible. There were too many men for the space available, and the manure-strewn floor didn't allow for much lying or sitting. Eventually, fatigue took over, and men found a spot, and they didn't really care what they sat on. Some ingeniously arranged themselves to sleep like they were on a four-man toboggan. Dad said we rode under miserable conditions. Food was practically non-existent, and toilet privileges occurred only twice a day. When the train would stop, the men would tumble out and squat in the snow and hope that a buddy had some kind of paper. Kriegies who had died since the previous stop were unceremoniously removed from the train and left in the snow near the tracks. The trip to Moosburg lasted 4 days and nights with long periods of waiting in freight yards, sweating out 2 bombing attacks by British Bomber Command. I'm not sure how he knew this, but Dad said the train car roofs were not painted with the required red cross, which meant that the train could have been mistaken for a German troop train and vulnerable to air attacks from the Allies. There were only 2 windows in the boxcar, both on the same side of the car at each end, and didn't provide nearly enough fresh air to mask the putrid odor of unwashed bodies, excrement, and vomit. There was also some sort of a can that the men tried to use between their twice-a-day mad dashes, and the man near the window had the dubious job of emptying it. With 60 men, nearly all of whom were suffering from the trots, this was an endless job. The guards made no effort to treat the sick men or take them off the train for just a few minutes of relief to get out of the filthy, smelly car. When the Kriegies made enough noise to get the attention of the guards, they were threatened with loaded rifles. Dad said it would have been like shooting fish in a barrel. And he commented that our mistreatment was not due in any way to a language barrier. In almost every car, there was at least one Kriegie who could speak German fluently, and many of the German guards had spent enough years in America to be able to communicate in English. The noise and smell of the sick and retching men prevented even the most tired man from sleeping. But like the livestock who had been the previous tenants of the train, many of the Kriegies perfected the ability to sleep standing up. On February 6, Dad was one of nearly 5,000 Stellalug Lift 3 Kriegies who arrived at the gates of Moosburg. Again, that's the little red circle at the bottom of the map. Moosburg, it was called Stellalug 7A. The usual guard towers and double rows of barbed wire greeted the weary, filthy men as they left their boxcar coffin for the last time, quite unaware of the conditions that awaited them. Dad would come to call it a Bavarian hellhole. Inside the wires was a prison camp melting pot, a teeming mass of men from the over 50 countries fighting against Germany. Built to accommodate 10,000 POWs at the start of the war in September of 1939, this 86-acre Stalag now held nearly 70,000 men, and it would grow again in the coming months as prisoners from all over Germany continued to be evacuated to avoid the Allied armies. And the group that went to Nuremberg eventually ended up there. There weren't enough huts or tents, so dads, like thousands of others, slept in the open ground. Oh, sorry, there's the boxcar. You can see it's very dark, and this is one of the windows. And this is Moosburg. So as I said, he slept in the open on the ground. Records claim that this stalag became home by the end of the war to 100,000 men. That's the equivalent of 1.9 million people per square mile. Aurora is 1.5 square miles. So this is almost 5.9 million people living in the confines of Aurora. In March, Dad had his first shower in 2 months, and it was his last known one until after he was liberated on April 29th, 1945. The story of his long hoped for freedom is a dramatic story in itself, with a few surprises and heartwarming twists. Here's a map showing, I won't say all, but 99% of the P.O.W. camps in Germany. This is Dad. This is where his enlisted men were, Stellalug Lift 4. Ironically, the day Dad's march ended in February, a new one began for 5 of his crew at another camp. Included in Dad's Chumley correspondence folder was Cliff Severud's. He was the 21-year-old radio operator. And he gave a detailed account of his march from Stellalug Lift 4 that he, Ralph Jacobson, Ralph Moore, Bob Zimmerman, Bingo Sipes, and 8,000 other Kriegies endured. Again, with little notice, they were told to fall out and to begin a 3-day march to another POW camp. However, this is their actual route. As you can see, they left the Stalag and they wandered around more than 3 days, and they zigzagged across Germany. They crossed literally from the Eastern Front to the Western Front, and then they turned around and went back. Their march was 86 days and 600 miles of frozen hands and feet, starvation, and beatings. They walked from the Eastern Front to the Western Front, zigzagging to avoid the Russians and other US allies. Their march became known as the Black March or the Death March, and their story of survival was drastically different. The full transcript is in the book, but I will share a few details. Dr. Leslie Kaplan, who was a marcher from Compound C, testified at the War Crimes Office, saying, "For 86 days, we marched in severe weather. Historic records indicate the temperatures were as low as 30 below. On starvation rations, slept in open fields where we sat close to each other, rotating positions often in an effort to keep everyone awake." I think you could read alive and warm, or in barns and filth beyond comparison. Anything beyond comparison that the American mind could comprehend. With miserable rations of less than 800 calories a day, we had to survive intense thirst with no sanitary water available. Thousands of men collapsed from malnutrition, exposure, pneumonia, and other diseases. No records exist or could show the miseries or indignities these men suffered. Men with fevers as high as 105 and with frozen feet had to march with the others or die, and at one point 50% of the men had soiled their own clothing as a result of dysentery. The German guards used dogs, rifle butts, and bayonets to push the men. Cliff wrote that he never forgot the pain or fear he experienced while walking. Thankfully, the story has a happier note, ends on a happier note. All 13 members of Dad's crew survived the war and their captivity, although several suffered physically and mentally the rest of their lives. Given that the average life expectancy of a bomber crew was 14 missions, or just a few months, the fact that they surpassed their statistic, being on their 20th, and survived the bailout, their P.O.W. experience, and their horrific marches is nothing short of miraculous. This is a 1986 reunion of Dad and his crew. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, Bingo Sipes went on to serve in both Korea and Vietnam, retired as a Chief Master Sergeant. And Gersh also served in Korea and Vietnam and retired as a colonel. After nearly 38 years, they reconnected and held reunions every few years or so until their numbers dwindled or they became unable to travel. And like he was, as their leader, almost waiting for his crew to take their final flight before he would leave, Dad outlived all but one. And surprisingly, that was Cliff, who went on the 600-mile death march. This is a shadow box Dad created to proudly display his hard-earned medals. And remember when I told you that Dad had carried all his crew's pack at one point during the march? This is the wartime log of his navigator, Nolan Gershizon, called Gersh. It was recently found by his daughter after I located her through a Google search to ask permission to use some of her father's quotes in the book. She was inspired to go through her father's things. It had been in the backpack that he tried to throw away. And inside was a drawing, of Dad's flaming plane and 13 airmen bailing out, with this note that I'll let you read while I take a drink. I don't believe that Dad ever saw this, but with his selfless act, he unwittingly saved this precious piece of history for her family. By telling Dad's story, we too can preserve the pieces of history of the greatest generation for our children and grandchildren and generations to come. Now I have to do a little self-promotion here. If you live in or near Aurora, the book is available at the Aurora Free Library. I believe you can purchase a copy from the Aurora Historical Society and Village History Center. It's also available on Amazon. You can follow my author page on Facebook at Journey with Baldy. And I've included my email address in case any of you would like to reach me personally. Thank you for letting me share this night with you. And now I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. I'll leave this up for a minute. Sam, can we look at questions while this is up, or do I need to exit?
We have no questions in the chat. We were
Okay.
all
Well, let
on
me
the edge
do
of
a
our
stop
seat.
share.
Yeah.
And maybe people just want to unmute themselves and ask a question.
That's right. And Cindy, thank you so much. It's even better tonight. I think it's going to be a movie. Can't we all agree that this is totally movie quality? And exactly, I see people clapping. It was so nicely.
Thank you.
Cindy, so much. And the work you've done, I mean, it's so driven through family connection, but I think this is so this is that part of history that's so personal, that connects all of us on the screen, that is kind of priceless. Maybe a movie wouldn't do it justice. So thank you so
Well,
much.
I do have an ongoing question for my audiences, which is, who would you get to play Baldy?
Yeah. What's your answer?
Well, it goes from Jake Gyllenhaal to Ben Affleck to,
Uh-huh.
Well, I just want to say, coming from someone who is like really close friends with Cindy and her family, aside from all of the war things, the story of Baldy's connection to the village of Aurora and the places in Aurora that were meaningful to their family is so worth anybody who's ever visited this place to read about, because it's so touching. It's just so very touching. I loved it.
Thank you. So Nancy asked, have you been in touch with all the families of your dad's crew? And the answer is no, not all. I obviously, as I said, got in touch with Gersh's daughter. I have been in touch with Neville's grandson. I'm still searching for a lot of them. The one thing that I did do that is kind of interesting, if any of you are genealogy buffs, there's a website called Find a Grave. And you can go to Find a Grave, type in Dad's name, and there's a picture of him and a little brief bio. But down at the bottom, I created what they call a virtual cemetery, and I found the gravestones of all of his crew members and made a virtual cemetery, so you can actually click on each one and go to their page and see if there's anything written about them. And I wanted to reach more of them, and perhaps that's my next project, but I was more excited about getting it published, and I didn't want to waste more time seeking people out. The other thing that we couldn't do as a family, which had been on the docket, was to go to England to visit the two bases where he was located in Tiverton and Hethel. And also we had planned a big family trip to Stellalug Lift 3, where there is a large museum.